Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're very pleased to have with us this evening Adam Kinzinger, who's here to discuss his new book, Renegade, Defending Democracy and Liberty in Our Divided Country. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. The chat function won't be available for audience comments this evening, but in that column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Renegade. Adam, I'm sure, is familiar to many of you. As a Republican congressman from Illinois, he served in the House for 12 years until last January, and in recent years grew increasingly critical of Donald Trump. Since the 2020 election, he's been especially vocal in opposing Trump's claims of voter fraud and efforts to overturn the election results. After the January 6th attack on the Capitol, he was one of 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Trump for inciting the attack. And he was one of only 2 Republicans who served on the House Select Committee that investigated the events of January 6th. Adam's been vilified by some on the right for his criticism of Trump. Even members of his extended family sent him a certified letter denouncing his criticism and regretting that they share the same surname. In Renegade, Adam tells his story, from his time on the Illinois County Board, where he got his start in politics, to his years in the Air Force, flying missions over Iraq and elsewhere, and ultimately to his service in Congress. He writes about how he came to the decision to stand up against Trump, even if it meant splitting with many in his party. Party he describes in the introduction of his book as hijacked these days by extremists who represent a real danger to our democracy. Having long regarded himself as a religiously inspired conservative, Adam now calls himself a conservative who has no home. But since leaving Congress, he's stayed engaged in civic action. He founded a centrist political organization named Country First, aimed at defending democracy, and he often appears as a senior political commentator on CNN. Conversation with Adam, we're also very pleased to have Geoff Bennett, co-anchor of PBS NewsHour. Geoff's a very experienced broadcaster who also has reported in previous positions for NBC News, NPR, and ABC News. So Adam and Geoff, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Brad. And Adam, it's so great to be in conversation with you tonight. And the news would suggest that the publication of your book is fairly timely. I want to start with your assessment of the chaos and paralysis on the Hill. I mean, House Republicans dismissing Jim Jordan as their speaker designate, but only really doing it in private.
Well, first off, by the way, it's good to see everybody. Geoff, thanks for doing this too. Brad, thanks to you and your wife for having me. Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think I could have timed the book better. It was not all that intentional. But yeah, I mean, look, if you can look back, and this is some of what I try to do in the book, it's like in telling my story, it kind of tells the broader story of what's happened to the country, but particularly to the Republican Party. You know, when I came in as part of the 2010 Tea Party class. And I think I used to say, look, the Tea Party in 2010 was very different than what it became in 2012. And I think that's true. But I think now, having the ability to kind of stand back and look at it all, you realize these aren't things that happen in a silo. They're all really together. It was this march to authoritarianism, this march to illiberalism, this march to where the whole thing becomes not about policy. It becomes about, in their words, owning the libs. It becomes about making your opponents upset. And so I think what you see in the House right now, there were always these kind of deep divisions, but when the Republicans were in the minority, all you have to do is just vote no on stuff. It's actually the easiest job. When we were in the majority, we usually had a big enough cushion that you could lose, a handful of Republican votes and still pass something. But also within the last few years, it's become this religion now that you can't put anything on the floor that needs the other side's votes to pass. And I say that from the Republican perspective. I think the Democrats did a pretty decent job of putting things on the floor they got Republican votes. So, it came down to, obviously, Kevin McCarthy, he put the writing on the wall when he, cut every deal, of which we don't even know what those deals were, because he cut them privately. We knew this was going to happen. I think he even knew this was going to happen, maybe not this quickly. And then Jim Jordan was the absolute worst candidate to put up when it comes to uniting a party. So, initially it was Steve Scalise that really surprised everybody. And by the way, Geoff, there is a lot of interesting high school going on behind the scenes. Kevin McCarthy hates Steve Scalise. It's just a personal beef. So he was supporting Jim Jordan against Scalise. Scalise won that fight, and Jim Jordan told Scalise, "You have one shot on the floor, and then you're going to nominate me if you don't win it." So Steve Scalise kind of honorably didn't get to 217, passed it to Jim, and Jim took him a while to realize he couldn't do it and to give up. So it's just what you see right now is just, I think, the open division now that has always existed, but finally the so-called moderates, I don't think there's really any moderates left, but they're actually starting to find their voice now a little bit.
Well, and that's interesting. Do House Republicans have the capability, the capacity to lead and govern when they're in the majority?
Do they have the capacity to govern? Look, I don't know. If they had maybe a 40-50 vote majority, yeah, because you can always kind of minimize the bomb throwers or the minority of a viewpoint. I don't know in this current setup if they do. I mean, I think we'll be lucky as a country to get through a government shutdown without having to shut it down. It's now only 30 days away. I think we'll be lucky as a country to get Israel and Ukraine aid on the floor and done. Ultimately, I think they will be able to govern to get those things done because the pressure will be too high. But in terms of pushing any Republican agenda per se, or really doing anything proactively for the country, no, I think the party is going to be in survival mode, and frankly, probably get its backside rightfully handed to it in the next election.
Another question about current events before we hop into the book. The fact that Jim Jordan lost 25 Republicans on the floor in public and then lost 112 behind closed doors. I mean, what does that signify? What does that show?
It's just cowardice. I mean, it's look, you can always convince yourself of anything when you're in Congress. For instance, I got to vote against impeachment because I need to survive, or that's what my district wants. Now, I would argue that most districts actually didn't want people to vote against impeachment, for instance, unless you're only counting the Republicans in your district. And that's kind of where they've gotten into. But what it shows is nobody liked Jim Jordan, but there were a ton of people that were too scared to say any other name. I mean, when I was listening to the roll call votes and I heard so many names come up that I knew because I've talked to them, they couldn't stand Jim. And they enthusiastically say Jim Jordan because they'll let the other 20 or 25 people take the death threats and take down Jim Jordan. They don't have the courage to do it. This is no different than what we dealt with in impeachment. And when we did the January 6th committee, the number of people that would come up to me, I mean, you can imagine, come up to me and say, "Good job, appreciate what you're doing. I can't do it in my district because I'll lose." And I go, "Well, you haven't seen my district then, because I would lose in my district as well." It's just, this is such a defining moment in this country. Like, how can you do anything else? But unfortunately, they could.
Well, you can laugh about it now, but at the time, was that infuriating? People would say that.
And it was terribly infuriating. At first I would just say thanks and just kind of try to maintain those relationships. But eventually I got pretty upset, and I wouldn't, yell at anybody to their face, but I'd just be like, look, this is a moment in history. And I mean, you can go down as a unknown congressman, stay here another 20 years, or you can actually do something with your oath. So yeah, it was infuriating. And towards the end of it, not as many people would come up and say that to me because I think they were embarrassed to do it. I mean, I think there was a sense of shame there, particularly when we started to really put out the information that we had garnered in the committee.
In the book, I was struck, you said that you felt some responsibility, not necessarily for January 6th, but for the rise of extremism in the country and the descent into dysfunction. In what ways?
So I think we all have to, if we're going to fix this, and not just the GOP, but we'll stick with the GOP in this moment. There is no good in pointing fingers at anybody else if you're not willing to take ownership for your role. Now, I can look back with a straight face and say, I didn't play the culture divide card maybe as much as I could have. I'm sure there was some of it, or the rage card, or the, using rage to raise money. It's like the most effective. Fear and rage is the most effective way to raise money. I can look back and say, I think I rose above that generally. But look, I mean, there were, when I was running for Congress the first time, it was all about let's get rid of Obamacare. And, I never went with the argument that there were death panels, but I never pushed back too hard on those things. And the first impeachment, I mean, I guess in a way, historically, it's probably good I voted against the first impeachment only because it allowed me to survive to play the role I did on the January 6th committee. But it's one of the things I'm most ashamed of is, I was very concerned with what happened with Trump and Ukraine. And when it came down to it, I found an excuse to vote no, which was the Democrats were rushing this. And I think they did rush it a little bit, but that's another point. But that gave me an out then to vote no. And I look back on it and go, yeah, I mean, again, historically, it's probably better I stayed alive to fight the January 6th stuff, but that was a vote I shouldn't have taken. And so looking back to be able to take inventory of what I was part of and what I saw, I think is essential. First off, to have credibility with everybody else, but also with myself to say, okay, here's a problem and here's how we fix it.
You refused to support Donald Trump in 2016, but you ended up voting for him in 2016.
Yeah.
Why?
Isn't that weird? I mean, I think I'm the only one that ever did that. So 2016, yeah, I didn't vote for Donald Trump. And for 4 years, that's the only thing I ever heard about from the base, right? You didn't vote for Donald Trump in 2016. And it's not like I ever, in those 4 years, went hardcore for Trump. I would try to stay out of the limelight with him a little bit. I'd go after him when I needed to, like when he'd retweet something about civil war, or he praised Vladimir Putin, those kinds of things. But in 2020, it was another weak moment. It was, I didn't want to lie and say that I voted for Donald Trump. And I also didn't want to say I didn't vote for Donald Trump because I didn't want to go through another 4 years of that. So yeah, that's something I significantly regret, particularly because we started to see, obviously the night of the election when he said stop the count and everything that happened really brought it to the forefront. But it's not like 3 months prior to the election, he wasn't, because he was still throwing doubt on the election system. And that to me is really damaging to democracy. So I justified it with the old, I don't want to deal with the blowback. I don't want to lie about it. And I lived in Illinois, so he's not going to win anyway. That's how I justified it to myself. But obviously, that's another one. If I could go back in time, I could never pull that trigger for Donald Trump again.
Is that sort of the mental calculation that so many other elected Republicans do? And I ask the question because, as you know, Donald Trump has given Republicans so many off ramps, well before the four indictments, and yet he's 40 points ahead of Ron DeSantis, and will most likely be the Republican nominee.
So it's interesting because there's always this battle. Anybody that knows political science well, which I'm sure everybody here does, there's always the battle of, do you represent the district or do you represent what you think is right? And, what's the balance between that? And so when Donald Trump, for instance, causes January 6th, when he gets indicted on all these different charges, people, their knee-jerk reaction may be to support Donald Trump, but what they're going to do the next second is look at things like Fox News, look at other leaders and see what they have to say. And I tell you, I would put all my money on if we had an alternate reality machine and we could go back and say, after Donald Trump did January 6th or after any of these indictments, if the leaders of the GOP, all these candidates for president, these congressmen and women and senators would have come out and said, as a party, we can't accept this. He's a bad human being. We have to move on. I think you would see a significant part of the GOP follow that. But when everybody that's running for president, let's just take that small group, says this is a witch hunt against Donald Trump, when they say the Department of Justice is corrupt, I'm actually surprised that anybody in the GOP believes otherwise. Because why would you not support Donald Trump if you truly believe that he's being attacked in a witch hunt? Even the people running against him say it, and it's such an unfair persecution. That I think a lot of this is not just on the shoulders of Donald Trump. It's on the shoulders of every leader that calls themselves a Republican for their inability and cowardice when it comes to actually leading. You're called a leader for a reason.
Well, in the book, you talk about your life growing up, which in many ways was the Midwestern ideal. It was this sort of stable and secure life that everybody wants. And at the center of it was family and faith. And you write about how your family, you were members of the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church. And for the unfamiliar, Independent Baptists interpret scriptures literally. Talk to us about that influence and how it affected your worldview and your approach, I guess, to politics.
Yeah, I mean, that could be an hour-long conversation. I still have very strong faith, but what the Independent Fundamental Baptist particular movement did is, I think it's almost a borderline cultish in how it acts. It's very much anybody outside of our religion is going to hell. You can't, it's still one of the few churches where you don't drink, you can't smoke, you can't dance, and you can't listen to rock music, and you can't go to movies. It's like, what's that?
Footloose.
Yeah, it's footloose. That's what it is. And so what that does is it drives into you that the world is very black and white. Everything is a dividing line between good and evil. And then what happened is in the 90s, and I was actually I write this a little bit in the book, is I was at the very first time, it was the Christian Coalition meeting in 1992 in Lynchburg, Virginia, when George H.W. Bush came and spoke to the Christian Coalition. So it was after the moral majority failed, and then Pat Robertson was taking his shot. And it was really the first time that kind of secular GOP politics openly married itself to this. The problem with that, and there's a lot of kind of the IFB upraising that I had that I appreciate. There's some comfort in some of it, although I left it. But what it really does is it was kind of the spark of Christian nationalism, which we see today, where there's not much of a difference between the United States of America and God. Jesus has these different political philosophies that somehow he never talks about in the Bible, that somehow we've assumed he believes. And so for me, that actually led, with IFB upraising, led to a very rebellious streak in high school and kind of early college. I failed out of college and had to take 6 months to get my head right and get back to college. And it's really helped me, I think, in my life now, and particularly in Congress and after, to be able to see what's happening in that context. When you see, for instance, just a quick example, when people talk about globalism or globalists, some people say, well, that's a secret word for anti-Semitism. Maybe, and to some people it might be. When I hear that, what I'm hearing is, particularly if it's in the Mike Flynn type crowd, is this idea that the UN or the one world government or the Antichrist is in essence the Democrats, and it's going to lead to this one world government where it ends up in a big battle against good and evil. And so I can hear those things because of my upbringing and know what people are talking about, when the vast majority of other people hear it and it passes through their ear because they don't quite understand it. And the problem is there's a failure in the pulpits today from pastors standing up and telling people that, like, look, Jesus doesn't care about tax rates, guys. I'm sorry. It's just nothing he bothered himself with. And really leading people that have good hearts and good intentions to what I believe the example of Jesus was, which was to care for the poor, to care for the downtrodden, and things like that.
Is there a way back? I mean, I remember when Michael Gerson was writing the Union speeches for George W. Bush and was weaving the lines from hymnals into the State of the Union address, like there's wonder working power, that kind of thing, into George W. Bush addresses, which you could argue is, I guess, a more pure approach than what we've seen now with the sort of melding politics and evangelicalism.
Yeah, look, I think there is a way to be a person of faith and to have that kind of included in who you are without drowning people in it or forcing it on people. So, for instance, 9/11, I specifically remember George W. Bush quoting the 23rd Psalm, and saying, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." And I think that's completely appropriate, because I think at that point, people are looking for hope. And even if you don't believe in the Bible, those aren't bad words to hear still. And it gives a sense of peace. And I think George W., for all his faults and everything else, I think he understood what it meant to be a person of faith, but also to be a leader of a secular country. And so I don't believe, and maybe somebody disagrees and knows an example I don't, but I don't believe he ever stood up and was like, in fact, he was the opposite. He stood up and said, this can't be a war after 9/11 against the Muslim faith, for instance, because, you know, that's completely wrong. We can point out terrorists, but not the faith. Where it changes then is when you see people that say, you know, literally, I think Jim Jordan is one of these that truly believes that Democrats are actually evil. Like they are actual evil people, and he will do anything to defeat them. And that's the strain that has gone from, it was initially this big, maybe in the party, or at least people weren't talking about it, to overtaking the party now. I mean, I put out a Substack the other day where there was a picture that some of the MAGA folks have been sharing. It's a courtroom sketch of Donald Trump next to Jesus in the courtroom. And, you know, it's basically showing that Jesus, of course, he's white Jesus that looks like he came from, you know, he's like 6'5" and everything. And he's sitting next to Jesus, and it makes it look like he's there with Donald Trump. And when you take the most flawed man to ever exist in the presidency, and you try to say that he is God's, you know, gift to America, you've gone really off the rails. And people believe this. They will tell you, well, look at King David. King David had an affair, had the wife that, you know, the lady he had an affair with, had her husband killed, and God used King David. Well, I believe God can use flawed people that make mistakes, but to look at Donald Trump and say that that's God's man in America is a bridge way too far.
In the book, you also talk about, of course, how you found your way into politics. You were a 20-year-old sophomore at Illinois State University, and you ran and won a seat on the McLean County board in Illinois. What was the impetus for that? What was the motivation behind that first run?
So I was one of those weird kids that at 6 years old, I started to like politics. And it was mainly the hot pink yard signs of a guy, because it's the 80s, that stuff happened. The hot pink yard signs of a guy named John Lewis, who was a Democrat running for mayor in Jacksonville, Florida. He went to our church. And I was obsessed with like the fanfare of politics, but that didn't go away. And as I grew up and my capability to understand it grew, my interest grew in it. And, you know, I was always involved, even through my rebellious period, even though I hid my interest in politics a little more because it wasn't cool, I thought. But when I was 20, I told you I failed out of college, got back into college, got some stuff straight. And a friend of mine named Lee Newcomb was on the McLean County board. And he said to me, I think jokingly, you should run for the county board. And the funny thing about it is I was 20 and I looked like I was about 11 because I looked very young. And but I took him seriously. And this was before, we kind of have a cool trend now where young people are involved in politics. This never happened back then. And so, yeah, I ran for the county board, and I remember I did a few like door knocks and then made the decision, I'm just going to call people on the phone, because I would show up at their door and give them my flyer and they'd laugh at me because I looked like I was 4. And I ended up winning. And it was an interesting time to start, and it was a good way to get your feet wet in politics and learn. The most important piece of advice Lee gave me on the board was don't say a word for a year. And oh my gosh, when you're 20 and you know everything, to say, don't say a word for a year, but I took his advice. And so then when I actually spoke up, which was literally 1 year and 1 second after I was sworn in, people actually listened to me because I had taken my time to understand what was going on.
And you resigned in what, 2003, and then in the Air Force.
Yep. So in 2001, obviously 9/11, and that's when there were 2 things in my life that really have turned my life on a dime. One was 9/11, another was a fight, or a guy was murdering his girlfriend in Milwaukee. But on 9/11, that's when I made the decision, like I got to go do something. I got to go fight for our country. And specifically, I wanted to fly for the military. And, you know, I didn't have great self-esteem. You know, I always had heard that to be a pilot in the military, you have to be great at math and science. And I wasn't great at that. And so I almost let that kind of take me down. I almost let that wear me out and not do it. But I ended up getting selected. And so that period of between 01 and 03, I still served on the board, going through the selection process. And then in the fall of 03, I resigned from the county board after winning re-election. So about a year later, to then go off to officer training and start my military service.
And ultimately served in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, I don't want to ask the question, what was it like? Because there's no way to answer that question.
Yeah.
How did that shape your view of public service?
It's a great question. So I will say I look back on those times with just, it's weird. And if somebody has served, they'll understand this. I miss it, right? You don't miss the violence of war, but like going there and being with the people you fly with, having the mission, we knew to go, what we did, we'd go out, we'd suck up cell phones, find bad guys and send special forces to them. And it was just like it's a time of my life that you'll never get back. And I think this is, by the way, a lot of veterans that come back with depression. I think some of this, and it's one of my regrets that I couldn't get accomplished in Congress, was we give them disability, we give them the VA, all that's great. We don't give veterans that return a purpose. When you're 20 years old and you just hit like the height of, you know, adrenaline and the height of a mission, and because you just got out of warfare and you're only 20, and we just pat you on the head and say, go fishing the rest of your life, you are constantly fighting with that. So for me, it was, you know, the time in Iraq, Afghanistan, and frankly, all over the world. I look back on it with a great amount of appreciation. But I will say, how did it affect my public service? I think in a very big way. And I think this came out on the January 6th stuff is, I remember when I ran saying publicly a few times, but I would repeat this to myself all the time, which is, if I am going to take a vote to send men and women to die for this country, and we have to have men and women willing to die for this country, if I'm going to vote to send them, I have to be willing to give up my career for this country. Because how in the world can I go to a funeral of a fallen soldier and say how noble it is that this person gave their life to defend America? Oh, but by the way, I'm not going to take this hard vote because I'll lose my job in Congress. And I thought it would be like a vote to reform Social Security or something hard. I didn't know it would actually be the defense of democracy and impeaching a president in my own party. But that stuck with me, and it's something I'm forever grateful for.
What do you recall of January 6th, that actual day that sort of seared into your memory?
All of it is seared in my memory, but there's a few highlights. You know, there's I very clearly see when I was walking from the floor, because I wasn't on the floor when this happened. I actually went out there on the start of the proceedings and then decided to go back and watch it in my office because I knew violence was coming. I predicted it. I predicted it on a phone call with Kevin McCarthy on January 1st, and he was very dismissive of it. I strongly remember walking to my office, passing a security checkpoint, and this police officer I know, she was listening to her radio, and her eyes were wide. And I said to her, I didn't say what is happening. I said, is it happening? Which is kind of an odd thing, but it goes to show that I knew something was happening. And she just goes, yes, they're using bear spray. Then I strongly remember being in my office and at one point taking my gun out and putting it on my desk. And this was particularly after we knew that the lines had been breached. And at that point, once the lines were breached, if somebody knew where they were going, they could get there. And I had plenty of death threats already against me, specifically from that crowd that day as well. And I never took my gun to the Capitol. We can, but I never did because there were so many police officers, but I did on that day. And then I specifically remember at the point I realized the lines were breached, I had talked to my wife on the phone and just standing up and in the back behind me. So if I'm sitting at my desk, behind me is a window that overlooks the west front of the Capitol where all that stuff was going on. And I opened the window. I heard all kinds of explosions and bangs. It was all the non-lethal munitions being used. And I just sense, look, you know, I've talked about what I believe spiritually. I'm not one of these people that just I walk around and say like I sense evil or darkness or whatever. I never have, except that day. I will tell you, I felt just a darkness that just felt like it permeated the place. And it was just like a stifling evil feeling. And I can't explain it beyond that. And you know, maybe it was psychological, maybe it was spiritual, but it was very real to me. And I, you know, also remember going to the floor to give my speech that night, and just being furious, and particularly being furious that after that happened, 136 people still voted against certifying, including Kevin McCarthy, by the way. And then lastly, in the highlights of memories, I remember going home at 3 a.m. and seeing my first National Guard soldiers. And to me, that was emotional because as a guardsman myself, I'm proud of them. And I was also really sad that they had to be there. I mean, at one point we had, 6 times the amount of troops in the Capitol complex than we did in Afghanistan. And that was the right number, but it was sad.
I read where you said that initially you thought that when you called out Donald Trump and you were very specific about the folks who were responsible for the violence, that you wouldn't be the only one, or one of 2 or one of 3, that there would be more Republicans to follow. But ultimately, that turned out not to be the case.
I mean, how could you not? I mean, I look back and I'm like, of course everybody's going to turn against him, because I had always believed that everybody had some red line that they wouldn't cross. I'll tell you, and I don't mean to make the comparisons because they're very different, but I will say now that I do understand how somebody like Adolf Hitler can come to power in Germany. Because you realize, yes, there are people that have an internal moral compass, but when that threatens their identity, who they are, what their job is, having to do something tough, it's much easier to put your head in the sand. And I saw that. And I'll tell you what specifically changed it. So for a couple weeks after January 6th, I mean, we'd all meet as a conference, all the Republicans, and everybody's kind of quiet. They don't know where we're going. We don't know what's going to happen until the day that Kevin McCarthy went to Mar-a-Lago. When that happened, my colleagues all started popping off and saying that they were still with Donald Trump because they had been beaten down so much that they didn't have the will to fight. And so I never realized that it would still just get down to like me and Liz Cheney. But at that point, I started to realize like this is not going to be as easy as it seemed. And it's really a sad statement on humanity, to be honest with you. And I'm an optimist generally, but this is a case where I realized that you can't assume, and this is important, by the way, for 2024, when you talk about the guardrails of democracy, you can't assume that people take an oath and that they will follow that oath.
Yeah, I'm going to invite folks to drop their questions in the Q&A tab. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see Q&A. If you click on that, write the question in the box there and hit, I guess submit, or I'm not sure what the prompt is, but we'll get those shortly. What was the decision matrix for you when you had the opportunity to join the January 6th committee? Making the decision that yes, you would do it, knowing what it will ultimately mean or potentially mean for your career.
So there was no matrix because I knew that I couldn't say no. Okay. Here's the deal. So when we formed it, Liz and I were the only ones that actually voted for the formation of this committee on the GOP side. And then I started hearing, if you can think back to that time, remember there was the discussion about Nancy Pelosi appointing a Republican into one of her Democratic seats, because at this point, Kevin McCarthy was still going to name members. And I just remember thinking, please, dear God, don't let it be me. I don't want to do it. I'm like, I don't want to do this. And I'm like sitting here, like, it's probably not going to be, I'm sure it's going to be Liz, but God, don't let it be me. And it wasn't. She picked, Liz, and I'm happy, I'm free, I can speak out, I don't have to deal with this. And then when Kevin pulled the Republican members, then I knew. So I was technically the only Republican on that committee to occupy a Republican seat, which actually is interesting because if I wanted to, I could have demanded my own staff, I could have demanded a budget, all this kind of stuff. But I just decided that it's important for us all to work together and pull together as a committee. So what happened is that, he pulled those members, like we started to hear the rumblings again of me now and Eric Swalwell and Jamie Raskin both talked to me and said, would you be interested in doing it? And I said, look, I don't want to do it. I really don't. But I said, if I'm asked, I'll say yes, because I can't say no. Like, how do you say no to something so big, so momentous and monumental? So then I basically, Nancy Pelosi announced me before she even called me. So I guess I really didn't have much of a choice. Yeah, that's a whole nother story. And, but I took it. And then, yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you, going into everything in the January 6th committee and knowing, like what the Benghazi investigations looked like and things like that, I probably took our chance of success, I'd say would be 5 or 10%. because I'm like, man, there is so much to know. How are people going to cooperate? And Congress never does anything like this successfully. Obviously, we were successful, and I think it's a moment in time that historians will study for a long time, particularly the committee.
Well, it was because the hearings were so focused on the storytelling aspect,
Right.
the narrative, and there was an art too. Take me into that, because I know that you worked, or the committee worked with folks who have no connection to politics, in an advisory role, and trying to figure out how best to bring the American people into the theory of the case.
So we knew, there was a lot of leaks, if you remember, from about the first 6 to 9 months of the investigation. That was frustrating to us. And my concern was everything's leaking out and we're not going to have any surprises left, right? Things to actually make an impact. And so we knew that, okay, we have this amount of information. We know the story. We can put the story together in our own minds, but you've got to hold the attention of the American people. And that most important thing we can do is to set the history of what happened on January 6th right. I want to make sure that when my kid is reading in his history books about this time in January 6th, that there is not the idea that maybe Antifa did this, or maybe it was the FBI, or maybe it was a false flag, or maybe it never even happened. I want to know that all the details are there. And the only way to make that impact is to tell the story. And we had so much material. Obviously video depositions. We had all the security footage from that day. We had a whole lot of stuff. And so we're like, okay, well, we're politicians. We can ask 5-minute questions and get 5 minutes of answers, but we can't necessarily put that together. So we brought in James Goldstein, who was ABC News president or something like that. And he brought a team in that basically knew how to put this together and tell stories. And they are the unsung heroes of the January 6th committee, because I think had we not been able to do that in the way that we did it, we would have put out probably the same report that's out that probably a fraction of Americans have even seen compared to those that watched the committee. And like I said, I don't think you'll ever see anything like that happen in Congress again, unfortunately. And I don't think it's ever happened before. But if there's ever a time to pull something off like that, it was this time. And I think, by the way, our hearings and our investigation were the only reason that the DOJ has actually moved forward on prosecuting people like Donald Trump.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Among the slings and arrows that sent your way, you write about a letter that your cousin wrote you, where she used the word traitor. And that word gets thrown around a lot, but you understand what that word means more than most, given your experience in the military and in Congress. I mean, how did you process all?
I mean, I'm still processing it. If you think about, like, the former president of the United States called General Milley to be executed. Like, how have we gotten here? So yeah, traitor gets thrown around a lot. And it's the one thing that does still kind of get under my skin, because the people that usually throw it around have never served anything bigger than themselves one day in their life. So I would go see my parents probably, I'd say, twice a month. I lived a couple hours north of them. And happened to be down on the day that we happened to receive a certified letter. And I opened it, and I saw it was from my dad's cousins. There's probably 11 of them. And I thought, I didn't think anything of it yet. And when I started to read it, it said, like, oh my, and I remember reading that and being like, oh, they're going to send a nice letter, saying how courageous this is. And it said, oh my, what a disappointment you are to us and to God. And it went on to say, you are in the devil's army. You've lost the trust of great people like Sean Hannity. I still laugh at that. And it just was it was a letter that I couldn't imagine even writing. I couldn't imagine being in the psychological state to write that to anybody, even an enemy, much less family. And that letter got out. It was a huge news item. And the interesting thing about it is I never released the letter. My dad's cousin did. She sent it out far and wide, and she obviously was excoriated for it. But, like, she was convinced that calling me a member of the devil's army would be good, for the public or whatever. But yeah, I mean, so that happened. And these are all things, Geoff, by the way, that I still, what am I, 10 months out of Congress now? I still am kind of coming to grips with the impact they had on me. Because when you're in combat and you're in the trench, you're fighting. You don't have PTSD while you're fighting because you're fighting. When it's over is when those things hit. And that's what happened with me. And, my co-pilot in Iraq, for instance, who now, by the way, is a JetBlue pilot, sent me a text that said he was disappointed to have ever served with me, or he was embarrassed to have ever served with me. I mean, it's the kind of thing that, like, the brotherhoods of war, to have somebody that you flew with send something like that. It does bother me. It did hurt, but I also just go like, what's in people's minds to do that? How bad are the MAGA brainworms that that's acceptable? I hear these death threats of these congressmen that are putting out, which I condemn. None of them condemned when they came out against me and Liz, but that's fine. But people that would wish my son Christian would be killed in traffic. The things that people would say and then couch it with, they're doing this because of God or something like that. That's where I said at the beginning how there's been such a failure in the church, that these people really think they are fighting on behalf of God by threatening to kill my 6-month-old kid.
Just on a human level, I'm sorry you have to deal with that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. It's like I said, I used to blow it off and be like, no big deal. And I realized like it did have an impact, but my wife obviously has been very strong in all of this, and I give her a lot of credit for it because, having a cop parked outside of your house all the time or having a security detail is not fun. But we made it through. It was a year and a half of it, but we made it through.
When it gets to some of the questions here, see from my friend Mayor Carnahan, she writes, what would you say to the American people to help them understand the importance of the 2024 election in terms of autocracy versus democracy?
Yeah, this is it. This is great. So I believe Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and whatever else is out there have got to have an uncomfortable alliance to defend democracy. Why do I say uncomfortable alliance? Because if somebody's a conservative Republican, but they understand the threat, they're your ally, even if you don't agree with them on anything, even the most controversial issues. I think this election is all about one thing: democracy's survival or not. We want to be able to argue issues. We're always going to argue a tax rate thing or whatever, guns, whatever the issue is. But if we lose our democracy, you're never going to be able to argue those issues again. And that's not a good thing. And so what I tell people is 2024 is literally just about, do you support democracy or do you not? And vote accordingly. If it's Donald Trump against Joe Biden, there is no question that Joe Biden would be the candidate to defend democracy, and Donald Trump would be the greatest threat to the United States of America, I think, ever. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. More than Al-Qaeda, more than anything we've ever faced.
That answers one of the questions from Eli Goldstein, who says, who would you support for speaker, and who are you voting for in the 2024 presidential election?
Well, look, I mean, short of a miracle on the GOP side, it would have to be somebody that calls out Donald Trump. And the only one I can see right now is somebody like Chris Christie. I would fully intend to support Joe Biden because, again, it's a binary choice in this election cycle. What was the other part of the first part of that question?
Who would you support as speaker? I guess like a dozen people now who are running for speaker.
Yeah.
That list or any of the Republicans who are now serving?
Well, I tell you what, this is kind of a pipe dream, but it may get more realistic. I would love to see a bipartisan speaker situation. I would love to see 5 to 10 Republicans vote for it. They're not going to vote for Hakeem Jeffries. So I hear a lot of people talking about that. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not going to happen. So let's just put that out of it. And Hakeem knows it's not going to happen too. But if you can get somebody that is, I don't know, throw like a Meade or Liz Cheney, or, and say like, here, 5 Republicans, all the Democrats vote for this person. I'm not running for it, just to be clear, but and then the whole goal of the speaker is to do what the job of the speaker is supposed to be anyway, to actually facilitate the House of Representatives working. What you do is you create better committee ratios so that it's closer to Republicans and Democrats. If there's a majority support for a bill, you put it on the floor. You don't have to worry about, what does the GOP or the Democrats say? I think it would be game changing for America to have a bipartisan or nonpartisan speaker that their job is simply to facilitate floor votes and floor action. I mean, I think it would heal the country, honestly. Given that that's tough to get to, There's maybe a few in the GOP I would be okay with. I think Tom Emmer, okay. I don't know how he voted on the election certification, though. I think he did vote to certify.
Yeah, he did. He voted to certify it.
Okay, so of the names I've heard, he's the one that I would be okay with. I would say Tom Cole, except I think he voted against certification. I like him. And he also nominated Jim Jordan on the second ballot. That kind of lost me. So I'm not enthused about any of them, quite honestly. I've lost a lot of faith in my old party, so it's not like I'm waiting for some miracle to happen at the moment. But I'll tell you, to see, and I've talked to a number of the 23 or 25 that voted against Jordan. They are dead set on opposing him, and it is fun for me to see the kind of people that have been angry behind the scenes actually start to find their courage to be angry publicly, because that takes a lot of courage.
Stephen Ellers writes, I'm a moderate Republican who currently serves in the Navy as an enlisted sailor who's looking to turn my military service into public service as a member of Congress from Northern Virginia. Representatives such as Liz Cheney, Paul Ryan, and especially yourself are my role models for this aspiration. Given today's Republican Party and bitter politics, what advice and guidance can you offer me?
By the way, thanks for your service, and thanks for wanting to be in politics. I mean, I think one of the dangers we have, and I have to try to remember this, is we've denigrated the position so much that we're losing good people wanting to do it. And the truth is, being in politics and serving is still honorable, and it should be honorable. So for somebody like you, look, all I can say is this: chase your passion in life, look for the opportunity to serve. So don't live your life trying to angle yourself for that right chance to run for Congress or House or whatever. It's like, because who knows when that's going to come, but it will come. And when that comes, you don't have to go on a guaranteed like suicide mission. I'm going to run if I know I'm going to lose, unless you want to, but don't be afraid of losing. That's the problem, is people fear losing so much that good people don't run. So look for that opportunity, and when it's right, strike. And I will say this: there's some things you can change a little bit, how you talk and what you say. Politics is not, there's got to be a little give and take, but on the big issues, just be very clear, very honest with people what you believe. And the thing I've noticed is when people believe that what you're saying, you actually believe, even if they don't agree with it, they respect that. More importantly, you can look at yourself in the mirror when that time comes. So when you run as who you are. Don't be apologetic about it. And great things can happen. The other thing is, paint a vision for people of what your optimistic vision is for the country, because people respond not to grievance politics. It does work some, but they do respond to people painting a vision and optimism for them, because that is so lacking today in today's politics. I actually think, Geoff, we are on, Donald Trump kind of caught lightning. He went in to break the system to become famous, and he happened to get in at a time when I think people wanted the system broken. I think nobody knows this yet, but I think there is a real deep desire to heal the system and heal the country, but people haven't seen an example of how that works because nobody's run like that, at least in recent memory. The person that catches that lightning, I think, can rocket to the top.
There's an anonymous question that says, what do you think can be done to heal the GOP from within? It seems to increasingly be taken over by vocal and influential extremists. What do we do about this systemic sickness?
Well, we've started to see some green shoots this week with, the 20 or 23 people that are saying no to Jim Jordan, that are, resisting the death threats. I think the best thing to heal the GOP is to put people in there with courage, that are willing to put everything on the line, to tell their base the truth. Because look, no matter what your opinion is of the Republican base, even the most hardcore MAGA folks, everybody thinks they're the good guy, and everybody thinks they're trying to do the right thing for the right reason. So you take these people with all this energy that's been abused. Donald Trump has manipulated and abused them and basically created a cult around himself. If you can take people with inspiration and leadership in that, talking to that same group, I think we might be surprised at how you can start to peel some of those people away. But I'm going to tell you, the best thing that can happen to the GOP is to lose, and keep losing until they realize that this acidic authoritarianism is not a winning strategy. And I think that's the best thing that we can control, more than even just anything from within.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you what happens to Trumpism in the absence of Donald Trump. He will at some point fade away. But to your point, his track record is that he loses elections, and loses elections for the party. So I hear you say, so long as that keeps happening, there'll be some course correction.
Maybe. Here's where I'm at on it. So we have a media ecosystem on the right that is reinforcing the anger, the hate, the fear, because it raises money and it keeps eyeballs hooked, and that makes a lot of money for media. That's a real problem. That's a problem I don't have a full answer to. But I think within, if we want to start talking about like how to heal it and how to bring people around, I do think when Donald Trump goes away, I would have said 8 months ago that somebody's going to take that mantle up, and that was when somebody like DeSantis was doing well in the polls by Trump being many on Donald Trump. I think there's a less than 50% chance, but not a non-zero chance, or not but a non-zero, whatever the answer is there, that actually when Trump goes away, Trumpism goes away too, because it depends who takes the next mantle. Is there going to be somebody that's hopeful, that's optimistic, that doesn't just sound optimistic and then go on TV and say that, Joe Biden has blood on his hands for Israel? Come on, that stuff's insane. And that's what one of my friends running for president said. And that was disappointing because he's a very hopeful, optimistic person, Tim Scott. It's going to be who comes along with a powerful personality that can pull that in. Vivek Ramaswamy, by him kind of having a ceiling of whatever it is, 8% now, has kind of given me a little hope that maybe Trumpism won't survive after Donald Trump. Now, that doesn't mean that when Donald Trump goes away, it becomes the party of Ronald Reagan again. Let's be clear. But it means that maybe that acidic strain goes away and that we have a chance to kind of pull it back from the brink a little bit.
In the book, you talked about how you got some advice. Someone had told you, or rather, former members of Congress had told you that there is life after serving in Congress. What has life been like for you after having served in Congress?
It's kind of like every day gets a little brighter. Decompressing from being there is, I realized looking back, like when I came back from Iraq in 2009, I immediately ran for Congress. And I've always said, I should have taken a couple months off to just take inventory before I announced. And it was kind of that way leaving Congress, is there's a few months where you're still having to remember that you don't have to have an opinion on everything anymore. You don't have to go to DC. But life has been great. We moved to Texas and it was kind of accidental. We live in the Woodlands now. And it was accidental because we just kind of stayed here in Texas when we had the death threats going on and we didn't feel like moving too far again. So I don't know if we'll stay here forever or not. So that's different. It's nice to be not walking around and you're everybody's former congressman. That's the one thing I didn't want to be. I'm still obviously recognized in a lot of places, but it's always nice people. So I guess if somebody hates me, they're not coming up to me in public. I've been doing a lot of traveling, a lot of speaking, and working for CNN, which I love because it allows me to stay out there and stay interested. So I would say life, the sky every day keeps getting a little bit bluer. But I also say the bug for politics didn't go away. And every day that the sky gets bluer, inside I'm like, maybe I'll re-enter this battle again someday. But it's not going to be the House of Representatives. That's for sure. I've had enough of that.
Yeah, we have one question here. What are the planes featured in the photo and on the stand behind you?
Oh, what are the planes? So this is actually the plane I own, which is a Merlin 300. So somebody made me a model of it.
Yeah, and in the book, it's about how you would fly home. You fly home.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I used to have a Mooney Bravo, and it was my medicine. And then this, by the way, that's my military plane, and a bunch of the guys signed a plaque for me. And that plane is the same version as that one, just a little bit bigger. Yeah, I used to fly a Mooney home all the time, and I kept it in Indian Head, Maryland, and could fly into an airport 10 minutes from my house. And that was medicine for me. Getting off of a tough week, if you can only imagine, then getting in the plane, it's a beautiful night. You're flying low over DC until you get out of the airspace, climbing up, throw it on autopilot. I'd have my iPad mounted to my yoke and I'd watch movies. and it was nighttime, beautiful, so therapeutic. And so I love flying. If I had to quit flying, it would. I'm retiring from the military soon, so that part quits, but I'm going to keep flying privately because it's like I said, it's medicine for me.
Yeah, yeah. When you think about getting back involved in politics, what do you see for yourself?
I don't know. I'm staying involved like with Country First and being out there and helping the right people. And so that's important. I would encourage, by the way, if anybody hasn't heard of Country First, go to country1st.com. And it's a nonpartisan organization helping people putting country above party. But I think where would my interest be? I would love to eventually be in the Senate, likely, because I love foreign policy. That's a very good way to be able to kind of influence America's role around the world. Governor, maybe president someday, I don't know, but certainly don't want to go back into the House. And I do not want to run for any local position because that's where you get real death threats, and it's from the person that lives next door to you. So anybody, by the way, in local government has my admiration because, when I had the death threats and I was, high profile at the time, people still felt like there was a layer of like distance or whatever, untouchability between you and them. When you're an election judge getting death threats, it's very different.
Well, the book is phenomenal. I've really enjoyed reading it, and I'm speaking with you this evening. It's Renegade, Defending Democracy and Liberty in Our Divided Country. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate you.
Yeah, great moderating, Geoff and Adam. Thanks for telling your story in a book and enabling all of us to read what it means to be a person of faith and a patriot who ends up coming to Congress and standing up for what he believes. And hope to see you back in DC someday.
Sure will be. Thanks.
To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. Just a reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Renegade. From all of us here at Politics and Prose,